Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'm David Leitner. I'm your instructor. Today, we are going to dive into what some of the regional variations of Archaic Homo sapiens were. How were they different? We already know some of the things anatomically that unite them, and that they are kind of a transition between Homo erectus and later Homo species. But how were they different? How were their little differences that distinguished them in different parts of the world? So let's get started. Okay, quick review. We're going to start with European Archaic Homo sapiens. Okay. In Europe, there are many sites, actually, for Archaic Homo. Some of the sort of best known come to us in Germany, Greece, France, and England. And they really range from about sort of 600,000 or 700,000 years ago until the present. Possibly as early as 800,000 years, but that's debatable. The first of these sites, and the one that actually gave the designation Homo heidelbergensis to this type of hominin, was in fact actually found in the village of Mauer in a quarry not far outside of Heidelberg in Germany. So Homo heidelbergensis. So, but since then there have been many others. This is the fossil, the original fossil for Homo heidelbergensis. It was just the mandible. That's it. Dates to around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. As I said before, it really sort of established the typology for the species. Other features would come to be known from other discoveries, but it's the mandible that came first. Now, one of the things to note about this mandible, although the teeth are still slightly larger than modern Homo sapiens, they're quite a bit smaller than Australopithecines and a little bit smaller than Erectus as well. So we have this continuing pattern of the faces becoming less prognathic, and the jaws and the faces becoming smaller compared to the rest of the skull. Eventually, this is going to lead to problems in us. This is why wisdom teeth are so problematic in modern Homo sapiens. And in fact, actually, many modern Homo sapiens are have evolved so they don't have wisdom teeth anymore. That's actually a relatively common occurrence nowadays. Not everybody gets wisdom teeth anymore. So it's kind of interesting that because the jaw started running out of space for the teeth, we're now selecting out those teeth. In addition, though, there have been sites in Petrolona, in Arago, and in Swanscombe in England. Probably the most important site for Archaic Homo sapiens in Europe, and possibly in the world at this point, just because of the sheer volume of fossils that we find there, is the Cima de los Huesos in the Grandolina cave systems in Atapuerca in Spain. Literally means the bone pit, Cima de los Huesos. And that is because it was basically a pit in the cave system. So you have the caves coming along like this, and then all of a sudden there's a steep drop off. And people were disposing of the dead by putting them down this pit. Interestingly, the pit would sort of go down, the bodies would hit some rocks the pit would go straight down, and then it would incline a little bit, and then the bones would collect at the bottom there. And as a result, we have one of the best representations of a population over many generations, and ages of death that we've ever found. It's also one of the oldest. These date to around 500,000 years ago, many of them. So 28 total individuals, ranging in ages from 4 to 35. So we've got a pretty significant chunk of the human life cycle there for this group. We don't know exactly why we don't have many older individuals. It's not necessarily likely that lifespans in the past were that much shorter, and it's a myth that Stone Age people had shorter lifespans. In fact, if anything, the thing that shortened lifespans was agriculture and the growth of cities. That significantly reduced lifespans. When you actually rule out, when you weed out sort of death from childhood illnesses, which again is worse in agricultural civilizations, the extent of the human lifespan has been between sort of 70 and 80 years old for most of human history. Like, we haven't actually changed things that much. We actually were adapted for life as hunter-gatherers. So that shouldn't be too surprising. But it's not certain why we don't have a ton of older skeletons from here. So that is sort of interesting as well. As I mentioned before, there's a species of archaic Homo sapiens that is classified as a separate species, Homo antecessor, that is strictly found in Europe, mostly in far western parts of Europe. And some of those remains were found in other caves nearby to this one as well. So, although these don't match the criteria for antecessor, could there be a connection between them? We don't know for sure, but that's an open question. Let's take a look at these bones real quick. What are the similarities to Erectus? Thick cranial bones, less rounded cranial vault, similar postcranial skeleton as well. But they are different from Erectus in the size and shape of their cranial vault. 1050 to 1390 cc. So you see right there, we're significantly larger than most Homo erectus right there. The brow ridges are more rounded, and the facial morphology, some of which resembles features in later Neanderthals, especially something called mid-facial prognathism. So this is where not the entire face has been drawn forward, but just the midsection. And what you'll notice is that in mid-facial prognathism, if you look down on the skull and look at the cheekbones, they're usually perpendicular to the face. They sort of run along the plane of the face. Well, with mid-facial prognathism, instead of being like this, they look a little more like that. One of the ways you can identify a Neanderthal from sight. Also, this may be where the double-arched brow ridges come from. The nasal bone forms a shelf. The cheekbones recede. As I was just saying, that's part of the mid-facial prognathism. So the question is open. Are these the direct ancestors of Neanderthals? Are Neanderthals their direct descendants? Probably not. But it certainly was a group like this that would have passed those features on. Okay, now we can move to Africa. African archaic Homo sapiens, we don't have a ton of crania. We have other remains, but crania are a little limited for us. We've got 4 that fit the criteria for archaic Homo sapiens. 2 of them are larger, 2 of them are smaller. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but we're not certain whether those represent regional differences, differences in time, or sexual dimorphism. It's difficult to tell with so little data to work with. The first 2 I want to talk about are Boto, which you can see up around the Horn of Africa here. Boto and Kabwe are both from more eastern or southern Africa. Boto is approximately 600,000 years old, found in Ethiopia. 1300 cc brain case, right there with modern humans. So get this idea out of your mind that brain size at this point is the only thing affecting intelligence. Discovered in 1921 and originally was classified a an African Neanderthal because of the similarities with Neanderthals. It had a larger brain case and arched brow ridges, so there was an assumption that it was a Neanderthal. Kabwe, on the other hand, also sometimes called Broken Hill or Rhodesian Man, was found in northern Rhodesia, which is now the country of Zimbabwe, and it is only about 125,000 years old. Again, 1280 cc's, approaching modern human averages there. Very significant. Both of them have large nasal apertures, large brains, somewhat prognathic midfaces, not nearly as much as those at Cima de los Huesos, and massive arched brows. Interestingly, and this is an interesting note, I'm going to go on a little tangent here, there are cut marks, or what appear to be cut marks, on Boto's face that seem to have been made by a stone tool. Now, before we jump to too many conclusions about why that would be, because in the literature, some of the literature jumps straight to cannibalism. But we have to understand what cannibalism means before we can sort of jump to conclusions about that. Modern people all over the globe have very different ways of handling funerary practices, how you prepare the body for the next life or for whatever is to happen to it. In many of these cultures, removing the flesh in some way, oftentimes after a period of time to give it a second burial, is a common practice. Okay. So it could simply be ritual defleshing. The idea being that the bones should sort of be clean and set, and the bones are sort of the uncorrupted permanent part of the individual, and they should be clean and set to rest. On the other hand, cannibalism is another possibility. But what does cannibalism mean? Well, cannibalism as a way of life, as a way of getting your subsistence on a regular basis, like something we just kind of do all the time, doesn't really happen. There are instances, but they are definitely outliers, not cultural norms, and they're usually looked down upon within the culture, or frowned upon. In fact, actually, most societies have major cultural taboos about the consumption of human flesh in any form. Some of you may be familiar with, there are certain Canadian First Nation peoples who have belief in something called a Wendigo, which is a demon spirit that either inhabits possesses a person who is undergoing severe hunger, or who is so hungry that they try human flesh, and then once they do it, the demon comes in and takes them over and causes them to crave it all the time. These are the kinds of stories that are kind of the norm around the world, with taboos against flesh eating, human flesh eating. That said, there are many cases where we see in survival situations where people choose to eat those who are already dead. It is extremely rare, but there are very famous examples. Some of you may have heard of the Donner Party, crossing Donner Summit here in California in the 1800s, who died very tragically. Many of them died very tragically of cold and malnutrition because they crossed the Sierras at too late in the season. They got snowed in. Sadly, too, from many accounts from the native people in the region, whose name I am tragically forgetting at the moment, they made offers to try and bring them food, but were shot at every time, and so eventually stopped trying to save these people. It's a very tragic story. Many of them resorted to cannibalism. Perhaps the more famous one now is the story of the Chilean national soccer team that was going to play a game and their plane crashed in the Andes. It's a fascinating story, actually, how they ended up deciding to consume the flesh of their friends and family. I mean, there were family members that had to eat each other, and how that sort of played out. Remarkably, many of them ended up surviving, and though certainly not unfazed, did sort of make it out of this sort of alive. More common than survival cannibalism is ritual cannibalism. Now, this exists on a very wide spectrum. It's not uncommon at all. It usually has very specific cultural importance and always has some symbolic as well as practical aspects. The Catholic rite of communion, if you are a Catholic, or Episcopalian, actually, for that matter, you believe in transubstantiation, that is the conversion of the bread and the wine into the body and the blood of Christ. So upon consuming those, you are engaging in a form of ritual cannibalism. I'm not saying that to denigrate these practices, but to try and sort of put them into focus for us, that even some familiar practices sort of fall under these categories. Now, there are also some more literal practices of cannibalism that occur all over the world. There are some tribes in the Amazon who mix the ashes of the dead with a kind of sort of paste made from various roots that is then consumed by the family and the friends and the rest of the tribe as part of the funerary rite. In those cases, it is literally to reincorporate the individual back into the social body, back into make that person part of all of us again. It can also be done to incorporate the powers of enemies or the qualities of enemies, so that's very rare. More often, when it's done to enemies, when you eat enemies who are defeated in battle, you do it to either to prevent their spirit from resting or to prevent their spirit from coming to haunt you and to cause problems for you. One of the most famous examples of ritual cannibalism is among the Foray people in the early 20th century who practiced a form of cannibalism whereby the dead relatives were the flesh was removed and then served to family members and then the rest of the community. Unfortunately, one person developed, at some point in the early 20th century, had developed a kind of mutated protein called a prion. And this prions are self-replicating proteins. And what this one did in particular is it replicates by basically destroying the brain tissue of the person. So it slowly sort of causes a kind of madness and neurodegeneration, eventually paralysis to the point where they cannot breathe for themselves, they cannot eat at all. And this was a very tragic sort of circumstance. But my point being, if we say they were resorting to cannibalism, it's not our sort of Wild West science fiction, post-apocalyptic, like, cannibals are bloodthirsty and they're gonna kill every human they come across to eat. That's not how most human cannibalism occurs. It's far more mundane than that. It usually has to do with funerary practices and beliefs about what will happen to the person in the afterlife. Okay. Again, are these skulls larger than the other two because of sexual dimorphism, or is it just an example of normal variation within the species? Could it be both? With only 4 crania to work with, that's really hard to talk about. That's really hard to make any judgments about. So it remains a big question to this day. The other 2 crania are partial crania. There's Ndutu and Sale. Ndutu is found in the Olduvai Gorge at Lake Ndutu in Tanzania. 200 to 400,000 years old, 1100 cc brain case. Sale is much smaller, only about a 900 cc brain case, 200 to 250,000 years ago, and interestingly enough, found in Morocco, which is far to the west and the north in Africa. So, interestingly, both have smaller brain cases, both have a high maximum cranial breadth. That is, the widest part of the skull is relatively high. On Homo erectus, it's relatively low. And they seem to have more rounded vaults, as you can see on the top here. Or, sorry, on the, so I don't know why I have Ndutu listed twice. Ndutu is the top picture and Sale is the bottom picture. Now, none of these 4 share some of the unique traits of the Cima de los Huesos, Archaic Homo sapiens. Which means that, a lot of, especially the features that would later progress, would be passed on into the Neanderthals. That should tell us something about the origin of the Neanderthals. It is highly unlikely that they started in Africa. There is some indication of sexual dimorphism, but again, it's hard to sex from just a cranium, especially when you're not. We have some reliability of telling sex from the crania of modern humans, but even that is a very imperfect way of doing things. Doing that with Archaic Homo sapiens is going to be even more difficult. Okay, let's talk about Asia. Several sites have yielded archaic fossils. Dating is difficult because of some of the geological peculiarities in Asia, but it is clear that Archaic Homo is there by at least 200,000 years ago, and would have shared the landscape at the same time with Homo erectus. So this one's really interesting. So you don't have this sort of disappearance of Homo erectus like you have in the other 2 areas. You've got this sort of side-by-side living going on until quite late, much later than the disappearance of erectus in Europe and Africa. In China, there are 3 main skulls, Maba, Dali, and Jinishuan. Yunqian, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, I do apologize for that, yielded 2 heavily distorted crania, so although the large brow ridges are used as evidence to point towards Archaic Homo sapiens, we have to be very careful about conclusions made from those because of the deformation. India is the other sort of place, particularly Narmada. We just have a partial Calvaria, as you can see here. So the top is the actual fossil, the bottom is a reconstruction. The white parts are the reconstruction, and the brown parts represent the actual fossil. It was first identified as Homo erectus, but it has a lot of more transitional features. The brow ridges in particular, you can see, are much rounder. The vault is a bit higher. And the overall estimated brain size is anywhere from 1150 to 1400, which would put it at make it larger than the largest Homo erectus confirmed, up to greater than modern human average. So it seems pretty clear that this is an archaic Homo and not an erectus. That's just another shot of it, so you have a better idea. Again, you can see it's less angular back here. It's more rounded. And it's much higher above the orbits of the eyes than the Homo erectus would be. Okay, so that's our regional variations for Homo erectus. This time, I'm going to talk about behavior next time. And until then, take care of yourself, have a great week, and I will see you soon.